Let's pretend it's the end of this whole ugly story. We vanquished the foe and we triumphed in glory. There's nothing but rainbows and blue skies ahead. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. We threw off the yoke and we broke all the shackles. We tore down the walls and we burned down the castle. The oppressors all scattered and naked they fled. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end.
Welcome to Before the Future Came, temporarily not a Star Trek podcast. We're looking at the ideals of utopian science fiction as we voyage from one work to the next, following a breadcrumb trail of motifs. This month we're talking about The Collapsium by Wil McCarthy, published in 2000. I'm Lucy, and gods of fucking algebra, does it take a declarant to see that?
I'm Melissa, and I represent an unbroken chain, decades long.
And I'm Gregory, a mad prophet, combed over but hardly couth. So excited for this one.
Oh, God.
Last episode, we discussed the wild robot, which had information transfer as a crucial component of community and survival. Today, we're talking about the Collapsium, which is also concerned with collaboration and information sharing in order to survive. Melissa picked it, so please give us a summary of the book in your own words.
All right, y'all. Fair warning. This book is over 400 pages, and so I did my best with the summary. All right, buckle up. Captain's log. 8th decade of the Kingdom of Sol.
Which captain?
Good question. Declarant Philander Bruno de Tawagi, a scientist with busted internet who works with a black hole-based material called Collapsium, is living alone with a bunch of robots on a tiny artificial planet in the Kuiper Belt. He's interrupted from his work on finding the end of time by a visit from Her Majesty Tamra Tamatra Latui, the Virgin Queen of all things, requesting that he save the queendom from the impending collapse of the ring collapsitor, which is a still in construction ring of these little black holes around the sun that would make communication and data transmission across the solar system far more efficient. Bruno agrees to help because humans are wired for monarchy. She is the queen, and he is one of her former lovers. Upon being faxed back to civilization with Tamra, Bruno meets fellow Collapsium engineer-scientist Declarant Philander Marlon Sykes, a fellow who harbors not one bit of resentment over Bruno's success as a scientist. None at all.
Not even a little bit?
I immediately shipped them.
Oh, God.
And it turned out great.
Queen...
You got what you wanted.
all the Philanders. The Queen drags him to a fundraising dinner party where Bruno makes something of an ass of himself by being awkward, getting drunk, throwing his wealth around, and then getting sick at the table. I guess that's what happens when you don't talk to humans for over a decade. Mm-hmm. After suffering through dinner, Bruno goes on a walk up a long staircase along a mountain on Venus, outside, no helmets needed, with his fellow dinner companions trailing behind to see the spectacle of what this elusive scientist is going to do next. What he's going to do is solve the engineering problem of the ring collapsitor with Marlon Sykes helpfully at his side while the crowd looks on. He's given an award for his trouble and faxed back to his little internetless planet. Then we find out Ghost exists, and that on a return fax, a copy of Bruno was made, and was so terrified that he left a residual echo.
End of book 1.
End of book 1. Captain's log, 9th decade of the Kingdom of Sol. Bruno is still on his planet, and still searching for the end of time, although this time by trying to use his baby black holes to create true vacuum. We do not have to care what that is. Queen Tamra shows up again with yet another disaster on the ring collapsitor project. After a lecture on Bruno's troubling little experiment with freeing a robot from its connection with the house that it normally gets its orders from, they have sex and then fax themselves back to civilization, because human genetics include a mechanism for awe in the face of celebrity. She is the queen, and he is one of her lovers. This time, we meet laureate director Delia Van Skettering, a manager of sorts, on an effort to hold the ring collapsitor up out of the sun using a set of cable winches, which we will probably also refer to as grapples in the course of this episode. We also rejoin Marlon Sykes, who is now absolutely high-key hostile and jealous. Man lacks subtlety. Bruno, Tamara, and Delia visit Marlon's weird, unstable, ostentatious Greek house, drink too sweet tea, and deduce that the problem with the grapples, the cable winches, is due to sabotage. Then all but one of the Delias and Marlons are murdered. A child cop, named Commandant Inspector Vivian Rajman, and her extremely loyal Lieutenant Cheng Xiao are on the case. The lieutenant shows the group a very cool but very unsettling reenactment of a double murder of Delia and Marlon, which is committed by a robot that was faxed in without leaving a record. As the murder investigation begins to merge with the sabotage investigation, Marlon's weird house is destroyed, Bruno has a heart-to-heart with the weird child cop, and they are finally able to find a suspiciously hiding ship containing a weapon that was used to shoot the ring collapsitor, cable winches. Bruno and Xiao have a conversation about what happens in a meritocracy if you don't have merit. Aboard the ship, the suspicious ship, is a heavily modified man that is a copy of someone we met in the first book, Wenders Rodenbeck, who opposed the Venus terraforming project. He committed suicide.
Heavily modified as in, like, extra limbs. Like, this dude was weird.
Extra limbs. Yes, we have not, up to this point, seen people that were quite so heavily modified. There's been lots of talk of fashion, but not that sort of thing. He committed suicide, and his other copy, who is more conventional looking and recalls having met everybody, has no idea how this all happened. He is not this kind of terrorist. Bruno leaves the grunt work to the grunts and returns to his little planet to find that his robot, Hugo, can at least walk now. End of book 2. Captain's log. Question mark. Who's the captain? 10th decade of the Queendom of Sol. Bruno is still on his planet, but has darkened his own little sun to have materials for his ring-based attempt to find the end of time. He decides he's ready to hang out with humans again and has the house fix his internet connection. It takes 9 seconds. It's been decades.
It's the best joke in the book, I think.
It's so good. It's so good. As soon as the connection's reestablished, a very sickly and abused man falls through. It's a copy of Bruno. He's been held by, dun dun dun, Marlon Sykes for years and tortured into revealing how Bruno's mind works in order to best get a leg up on Bruno in this intellectual race that Bruno isn't competing in. Bruno and his fax copy, Muddy, realize that Marlon is destroying dangerous collapsitor ring stuff to destroy the sun when one of those cable winch stations comes hurtling out of the system with Delia on it. Bruno and Muddy rapidly devise a way to reduce inertia when traveling quickly in space and build a little Wallace and Gromit style ship that fly off to save Delia and the Queendom.
It doesn't have an airlock. It's just got one door.
It just has a door.
Which becomes a problem.
It does. As one would... I mean, I honestly could not help the Wallace and Gromit image in my head of them going to get cheese. But along the way, Bruno faces what he considers to be his lowest self, a sniveling, scared, abused version of himself that starts out pretty hopeless and pessimistic. I am leaving out an immensely boring amount of technobabble. There's so much boring.
I love the technobabble.
I love it too, but there's There's
could not be
nothing for
expected
it
to
here.
summarize it. We
No,
know how
no.
all of these devices work. Well, I'll be talking about this.
Good. After collecting Delia, the trio careens into the inner solar system in search of the Queen. They find the platform where the Queen was and are able to recover the 2 cops and one of the Queen's aides, but not the Queen herself. She died in an act of rashness, saving nobody. They communicate with Marlin via radio signals. Marlin is extremely ready to show off how smart he is and brag to Bruno about how Bruno has not discovered the end of time. They frantically search for Marlin's secret base, which they find on Mercury, the closest planet, facing the sun, readily available for close communication. They find the base, they invade it, they run a gauntlet of a sequence of rooms, just like a nice little dungeon, until they get themselves to the boss. The boss is not the ginormous spider with hands, who is once again their friend, Rodenbeck. It is instead Marlin.
It's the curse of being a poet.
It is. You just get to be all the enemies, apparently. Oh, that poor guy.
The mini bosses, to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the mini bosses. Words are exchanged. Monologuing occurs. Xiao subdues Marlin and handcuffs him. Bruno successfully re-enables the fax machine in the room in order to get help in and out, and then sits and cries for perhaps 10 weeks over the death of the Queen. Bruno is, by force, completely without his consent, crowned king. The Queen is revived, although she is a copy several years old, and they live happily ever after. And we are given to understand that we have been, in fact, reading a history book this whole time. And that is the end of book 3.
I loved this book. I thought this... I really enjoyed it all the way through. I want to read the sequels. It's a whole series.
It is a whole series. I liked it too. I wasn't sure that I would. The pacing was weird. It definitely felt like 3 books, 3 distinct stories.
I have more mixed feelings about it.
Well, we can get into it. We have each brought a topic for discussion. Mine is technology, hard science fiction, and soft science fiction. So, the Wikipedia article for The Collapsium opens with, "The Collapsium is a hard science fiction novel." And that's a term, like, if you're not a big sci-fi reader specifically, people talk about there being 2 kinds of science fiction, hard science fiction and soft science fiction. And like all taxonomies and all binaries, it doesn't work. It's a spectrum and also doesn't mean anything. But generally speaking, people mean one of 2 things and rarely specify what they mean when they say hard and soft sci-fi. Sometimes they mean hard sci-fi deals with sci-fi about hard sciences, physics and engineering and chemistry and biology and things like that. And soft sci-fi does soft sciences like sociology and I don't know, Borges could be considered soft sci-fi, right? Like
Psychohistory.
Yeah, psychohistory, weird linguistic stuff, etc. Or like anthropological stuff like The Dispossessed or something like that. So in that sense, like Foundation would be considered soft sci-fi, even though it doesn't have faster than light travel. Because the other dichotomy that people do is that hard sci-fi like cares about whether its technology makes sense scientifically or what can be justified scientifically, and soft sci-fi doesn't. So from that perspective, like, generally, if there's not faster than light travel, it's probably hard sci-fi. If there's like a magical warp engine that lets you go faster than light, that's soft sci-fi. So Star Trek and Star Wars, soft sci-fi. We're not talking about those because the strike is still ongoing. But hard sci-fi would be like the series of books called The Expanse, which doesn't have faster than light travel. And this book feels like hard sci-fi, and it's very concerned with hard science physics. But also, while that's kind of the driver for the plot, the story of this book is about a bunch of people and how they interact and kind of are bounce off of each other. And the science that explains it all is, I mean, we learn exactly what chemicals that these collapsium nodes are made out of. There's theories about like exactly how these weird grapples work that allow you to pull on, like, sling yourself around the solar system like Spider-Man by pulling on planets and stuff.
So cool.
And like that's all soft sci-fi sort of stuff. That's the ability to travel in an inertialess ship by Spider-Manning your way across the solar system and faxing copies of yourself from place to place. That's all soft sci-fi stuff. Like the transfer, the way the fax machine in the book literally works is it disassembles your body, killing you, transmits the information about you to the other fax machine, which then reassembles you out of base matter. And like that feels like soft sci-fi technology, even though it's explained in techno-babbly things that feel like hard sci-fi. And this is a hypertech book with a plot that revolves around interpersonal drama, and yet it feels like a hard sci-fi book. And it's a really interesting like push and pull there, and it to me kind of exposes the lie behind that taxonomy.
I actually didn't like. I wasn't even familiar with those sort of ways of defining hard and
really?
science fiction. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, if you read like I don't know, a lot of old sci-fi short stories, like in magazines and stuff like that, or in anthologies, they make a big deal about one or the other.
Oh yeah, I sort of thought it was a way of being like a sad puppy and being like, well, this is why it's really important that we only include old white men in things.
Yeah, but like
instead of things like Octavia Butler.
Ray Bradbury is a classic example of an old white man who is beloved by good and bad people alike, but is a soft sci-fi writer 100%. Like Ray Bradbury doesn't care how the ghosts of Mars work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that you could have white men be soft sci-fi, but I think it had felt, I'm not disagreeing with you, by the way, I just sort of thought it was a more, like, here's a way to be sort of gatekeepery.
Yeah, but I mean, it was initially, like, came out in the fan and critical sci-fi press at a time when, like, they were still reaching for ways to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think there have been, at least, I will say as a youth who read sci-fi, there was a gatekeeping aspect to it. There was an aspect of sort of masculinity associated with hard sci-fi.
Yeah.
Especially with, like, there being more of a chance to have things like romance in soft sci-fi books. I'm saying this as if these are a real thing, right? But it's obviously it's not. But there's that association of like, oh, it's closer to being a girl book if it's soft sci-fi. So I definitely struggled with that at a tender age of internalized misogyny, etc., etc.
And I think it also, like, another gatekeeping aspect is, like, there's that idea of, like, soft and hard gender stuff, but there's also, like, if you're, it's sort of the geek cred thing, or the nerd cred thing, of, like, well, we were sci-fi fans back when you had to get a book out from the library, and all of these people that are only fans of Star Wars and Star Trek that appear on, you know, in movie theaters and on television, well, they're, you know, they're Johnny-come-latelys who only like soft sci-fi. And
to make matters worse, many of them are girls.
Yep, because girls don't like real science. They only like it if it's
you like hard science fiction. Prove it. Explain to me a theorem of space travel.
And this book is sort of like it's doing a little bit of, I don't know if deconstruction is the right word. It's riffing on the genre conventions of this sort of sci-fi, because this is, you know, came out in 2000, but the it very much feels like a Heinlein book in the sense of like there's this reclusive genius who has fucked the queen and has these rivalries, and boy, if people keep dragging him to events when really he just wants to develop his special science, and that sort of thing is examined and pulled apart and undermined over the course of the story, but it's still this swashbuckling science genius adventure story, and that's, I don't know, that's a interesting, weird. This book feels like it's on the cusp of a lot of things. Like, it's not particularly overtly queer in representation. Like, there's minor implications that some of these people might be gay or bi or whatever, but those are like very, very subtextual and maybe just our modern sensibilities reading into things, and that feels weird to me. Like to have this story, even especially since it's aping Heinlein, where Heinlein books have gay and pansexual people all over them, and trans people and so on. And this is very like, with all the body modifications and so on that happen, no one is like, oh yeah, that person was assigned male at birth. There's none of that, which is strange. But at the same time, like, its approach to the blending of technobabble and relationship stuff feels like it's part of the sort of post-2000s sci-fi movements towards a more diverse sort of plots in sci-fi. So, I don't know. That was weird to me. This has its feet on both sides of many boundaries.
Speaking of boundaries that it is straddling, I want to talk about wealth and labor a little bit in this book. Maybe more wealth than labor. And the straddling that I want to talk about is sort of capitalism. So there's this tension kind of throughout the novel with regards to what the value of money is, like how much money is a lot of money, and what is it best used for, and what labor is best used for. So the narrator, our historian or whoever is telling this story, and therefore Bruno acknowledges the presence of plutocrats. There are still obscenely wealthy people. There is still a laboring class. It's not clear, though, if this is truly a capitalist society, but the touch points are ones, the references are ones that we understand courtesy of, I think, us living in a democracy, and specifically put air quotes around this, a democracy, in a capitalist structure, because these are kind of two things that get referred to. So one of the things that comes to mind is that almost immediately we are aware that Bruno is revoltingly rich.
It's established he's the richest human being, period, because he invented Collapsium.
And he has a son, like a personal son, right?
Yeah, like a star. Yes, he has built himself a sun to orbit his tiny planet.
Yes. His artificial planet, right? Because the planet is full of the building blocks of Collapsium as well, because those later get used in a scene that absolutely makes me cry. I should have mentioned that scene earlier, but
yeah, they build the Wallace and Gromit spaceship out of his home. They like disassemble every bit of his planet and his fake star, which is already burned out and so on, and make it into this fancy spaceship.
Right, and I guess I'll divert to talk about that. One of the interesting things about Muddy, the Fax clone, is that he is more... I don't know how to talk about this, because I think in some ways Bruno can be considered autistic coded. And so it is... I will say Muddy is much more emotive in the way he relates to people than Bruno is. And so when Muddy realizes that the house is going to be destroyed. The house is what we would call it a smart house, right? Like, it talks, it has personality, it manages things and changes materials and does all sorts of things. It's practically a person. And when Muddy realizes that the house is going to be destroyed in this final process, as this planetoid is destroyed, he just has an absolute come apart, as Lucy would say. Just has a complete sobbing, like, shouldn't we say goodbye? Shouldn't we, do that? And that scene got me. Anyway.
They save the house. They save the AI. They
Yes.
put it on a disc, and it ends up being a ship.
Saving
later.
the day?
Yeah.
Really comes in
saving
clutch
the
at
day.
the end, right?
Yeah.
It does, because it is used to help control the fax machines in the base on Mercury. I hope we start a tradition of one of us tearing up in each episode.
We'll
Last
see.
time it was Lucy. Now it's me. So, when we see that Bruno is this rich, like right off the gate, and what he's talking about are the difficulties of being a rich scientist engineer out in the back beyond, which is that it has a limited supply of this very expensive material, these collapsons, these noobles, and because he has this limited material, he has to be really, really careful about how he uses it so he doesn't waste it, because it is, he can afford to engage in this non this labor that does not produce capital in a distinct way.
It's just sort of like exploratory research.
Right. He doesn't have internet to send back his search result, like what he's coming up with. He's just living alone doing this stuff, which is cool, but he has enough material to eat forever. He's set himself up in a particular way where he can spend his time doing this and does not seem to need the structures of the rest of society to get by. But when it comes to like the logistics of bringing in more of this material that's difficult, this is where he's like, oh gosh, here we've run into the difficulties of being wealthy. I could, but wow, I balk at the sticker price. And it's just this weird tension of like, we see later when he goes to this dinner party where he gets himself sick, getting drunk, that like, this is a place where people just buy planets. Someone owns Venus and they want to terraform it, but they don't have the money out of their pockets to do it. So they're holding a fundraising dinner for it. And there's this sort of aw shucks. There's a certain liberalism to that fundraiser dinner of these sort of elites sitting around, all of them moneyed. Like, even that artist, you don't get the sense that this is a starving artist, right?
Yeah, the dude's like the most famous playwright in the solar system.
Right.
He also has the most hands of any playwright in the solar system.
He does.
By the end, yes. He just keeps adding limbs every time Marlin introduces a new version of this dude.
Actually, it's 6 hands both times.
Is it 6 hands
right?
both times? He's
has...
called a spider in the final dungeon crawl.
I thought he only had
the
extra set in the first, but I'm not sure either.
Oh, you're right. It might only be the extra set. The spider, they say spider, but he only has 6.
Okay.
So it seemed like spider body configuration, but only 6 arms. It's a lot of arms. So in terms of this political system, you've got these plutocrats that are owning, there are only X number of bodies in the solar system you can own, right? Only so many planets or moons or whatever size thing you're looking at. And they're being bought up, they're being controlled, they have already terraformed Venus to the point where you don't need to wear protective equipment to go outside in many of the areas, at least some of the areas where there are like
in
mountains.
High altitudes where it's not too hot.
Exactly. And they talk about bringing Venus to life. They also talk about bringing planets to heal. The sense of wealth, like even in this discussion in which we have Rodenbach saying like, we should leave these things alone. We should leave something alone. We don't have to change everything. And then we have these rich people arguing about, how do we best do this? Can you just give us the money? There isn't a sense that like anyone else gets a say in this. And in fact, when the owners of Venus tells Rodenbach, like, when you buy a planet, you can do what you want with it. No one will say anything.
Mm-hmm.
But there are going to be people living on that planet ultimately. At least that's the implication, is that they're not just terraforming it to turn it into, I don't know, a ski resort for themselves. They're going to want things on that planet. So anyway, my point is that this book is as confused as Bruno is, I think, about wealth. It is living in Bruno's head about this. And Bruno has this real aw shucks thing about it. He gets drunk, he offers, he's embarrassed himself, and he offers to give $100 trillion to the terraforming of Venus, which he gave no shits about before he got there. Gives no shits about as he's offering up this money. It's just a number he comes up with that he can afford with no pain.
You say aw shucks, but I think that scene in particular makes it clear that it's not that he is self-effacing about his wealth and like trying to play it off. I think his wealth is a deep source of shame for him. Because
yes,
like,
you're right. Yep.
He bids too, like he makes too high of a donation, and when everyone in the room stays quiet, that's when he completely breaks down, and that might be when he's sick on the table, and like he's like, oh no, I'm too rich, and like I don't know how to, like, I just want to be an engineer. I don't want to be a rich person. And like, I mean, that doesn't excuse him, right? Because he could immediately stop being rich. Like, there are ways to do this. But also there's this weird, like, this is a world in which aging has been cured. You cannot die of old age anymore. Every disease has been cured because you can just go through a fax machine and have yourself cleansed. In fact, you can send yourself through the fax machine to not be drunk anymore if you want to. Right. Or you can have the fax machine produce a drug that will counteract your alcohol. There's the implication that presumably everyone has as much food as they want. You can build structures incredibly cheaply. And so, like, this probably is a world without poverty, but also is a world where people can be so wealthy they can own planets. And I don't know how that all works.
Some of that discussion about democracy and wealth and monarchy made me curious, because I wasn't sure all of a sudden if Wil McCarthy was American or British, because some of that stuff sounds very British. He's American. I did uncover. I just want to share one thing, though. Apparently, he won the Prometheus Award, which is a big sci-fi award, in 2022 for a book called Rich Man's Sky. So I do suspect that there is, like, some of these things must be percolating with McCarthy. I assume, in his writing. He's also, by the way, an actual rocket scientist, formerly worked for Lockheed Martin.
And he's released a nonfiction book basically detailing the theoretical basis behind these, like a this is the way science could go, kind of explaining all of this, and is big into programmable matter and stuff like that.
While he was an editor for Wired in 2001, he wrote a story on programmable matter, objects that could be altered via an external input of some kind. And then the book he wrote was called Hacking Matter in 2003. And then apparently, I'm reading this very quickly, he worked with the person who made Blackberries to create Raven Brick, which has something to do with solar power.
Oh. Yeah. Cool if I could charge my phone in the sun.
There's also a thread that runs through this book concerning capital and wealth that is especially apparent with the cops, Vivian and Chang, where Vivian is this highly experienced detective, and Chang is like the second best cop in the solar system. And Chang is like, I'm always going to be her number 2 because she's never going to die. And that's fine. I've come to terms with that. And I know that the second book in the series is about the kids of Bruno and the Queen, the son of them, and him being dissatisfied with the fact that he will never get to become anything other than what he is, because, you know, he's not going to be able to replace anyone. And that feels to me like it's talking about ancestral wealth. Like, the idea that, like, well, they've got their position, and so they've got literal monetary capital, but also social capital that's unassailable. Because, like, if you work and work and work to get better and better at your job, as long as they're continuing to get better and better too, you will never get a promotion because they're getting better at the same rate that you are, and they just started sooner. And that's the book. I think thinks that's bad, but I'm not sure that the book has a vision of what it should be instead.
I agree, because I mean, this book is also heavily examining ambition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is ambition? We have two examples of that shown very, forefront. Obviously, is Bruno and Marlon, and Marlon wants to win and be smartest. That's his ambition, whereas Bruno ostensibly wants to find out cool shit. The discovery is purportedly the ambition. Neither of these people seem to need to work to feed themselves. This book is listed as sort of a utopian fiction book, in part because I think it's assumed that humanity, everyone's got fax machines, right? And the fax machines don't cost anything, or material for them doesn't cost anything. The things at that level are not discussed. But I feel like if you don't address what ambition is good, then the question of, do you care about promotion, gets harder to unravel. This also seems like something that might just be percolating in Wil McCarthy's head at this point, right? Of like, what can you do in a society that has plutocracy with things like ambition?
Yeah. I think the only worker we see, the only person who's not a member of the ownership class, assuming that the Queen's handmaidens are kind of minor nobles, is Delia. She seems to be the only named character who ever does any work. Delia and, I mean, the robots, I guess. And like,
Delia's
everyone else is
manager.
either a cop or a rich person. Yeah, Delia's came up from being a laborer, so she's a boss.
Yeah.
But unclear where her political sympathies lie.
I mean, I think it's pretty unclear how the society is structured at all, right? Like, I don't have a sense of, is there an underclass? Is there a proletariat? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think I could answer that question. I think
there are some things that give me clues that there is some sort of class. So, for instance, these page numbers will not align with yours. But
yeah, Lucy has the original hardcover, and we've got the Bane trade paperbacks.
Yeah, on page 133, they are talking about I think they're talking about the whole cable winch grapple system.
Early in chapter 8.
Yeah, and Bruno says that Bruno can't help but be impressed. A project like this one, however ill-fated, bespoke a queendom far bolder, far wealthier, and more ambitious than the one he'd left decades ago. With death a hunted quality, faxed away with every minor journey, perhaps civilization was finally able to take a longer view. Was it easier to make such pipe dreams come true when the benefits were for the builders themselves rather than some hypothetical posterity? The builders themselves part to me, implies that there is some sort of working class. And then later, when in sort of the democracy sections, the biggest one is right at the beginning of chapter 10, which in my book is page 153. They're talking about, like...
Well, I just wanted I mean, I haven't found the section yet that you were just reading in chapter 8, but I don't inherently read builders as being a class. I mean, we're talking about engineers, so I do think they see themselves as builders in a way.
Oh.
I mean, Bruno is a builder.
They might be talking about the architects.
Yeah. I mean, Bruno's literally a builder, right? Like, he makes all these things, and it's Muddy who builds the Wallace and Gromit ship in the end. So... And
even Muddy isn't directly building it. Like, Muddy's using robots and computers and
right.
tools that are very, very far removed from being direct control.
Right, but they were not using, like, peasants.
Right.
Yeah, there's no sign of service workers. There's no sign of craftspeople. It's all bosses and robots.
Yep, that's a good point. Yeah. And okay, so I'm thinking about this democracy stuff, right, where they're talking about the value of individual action. This is page 153, right at the beginning of chapter 10, in the first paragraph. Society, it was thought, worked to maximize the power, and with it the accountability, of each of its members so that success and failure and happiness and misery might be had in direct proportion to the effort invested. Turns out this was a load of hooey all along. People hated that sort of self-responsibility. Always had. Etc., etc. And
that's why they elect a queen.
Yes, it's why they elect a queen. In addition to, apparently, the genetic inclination we have towards celebrities and monarchs. When this book talks about people, quote unquote, this way, I kind of have to think it can't be all playwrights sitting at fundraiser tables, right? There have to be normal-ass people.
Maybe anyone who's not rich is just living a life of constant leisure.
I mean, it does actually literally go on to say, only when it was inescapably universal, when there were no more corrupt or uncivilized third worlds, that's in quotation marks, to flee to, did it become clear that what people really wanted in their secret heart of hearts was a charismatic monarch, which seems to imply something.
Yeah, that everyone's at least fed and can take off work if they want to.
But Americans, for instance, don't consider the unhoused population in America to be third world. You know what I mean? Like, if this is a book by an American author written for an American audience, let's say, third world doesn't mean just poverty.
But the implication there is clearly that, like, once there weren't big problems anymore, that's when people became dissatisfied and decided they wanted monarchy back.
Yeah.
And, like,
I'll buy it. Yeah.
The feeling of this book is not that, like, there's a secret, like, ghetto where all the poor people live and scrabble for food while all these rich people are jetting around.
No.
That's not the implication. I mean,
I just think Bruno doesn't give a shit.
Yeah. And the book doesn't really give a shit about what normal people are doing.
And yeah, so I started being fascinated by the fact that, to me, it is unclear what the economic system of this universe is. And then that had me thinking about other things. So anyway, thank you for this investigation. I want to read other books in the series almost just to find out what the fuck, who else is in this society.
I'll probably read Rich Man's Sky just because I'm curious to know where he is in 2022.
Yeah.
I feel like a case of appendicitis might be coming on. I'm going to put myself in the fax machine really quick just to fix it. I want to talk about the appendices to this book and how you were meant to read this book. I am fascinated by this sort of, I guess, text structure that McCarthy has chosen for this. So my sort of inquiry question is, how are the appendices used in this book? And I guess I will first just share that there are 4 appendices. The first appendix, Appendix A, subtitle, in which an appendix is provided, is basically a bunch of definitions. I'm going to say more. I'm going to say more in just a few minutes. They're like a couple pages long, and they kind of get into the science of some of these terms that we've been bandying about. Appendix B is a glossary. Appendix C is technical notes. And Appendix D is titled Marlin. Only Appendix A is actually cued in the book. So you see in footnotes that you can go and refer to Appendix A. Appendix B, C, and D are just appended and never referred to in the text of the book. That is interesting, an interesting thing. Mm-hmm. So when I think about how are these appendices used, it definitely provides us some additional science, I'll say fun science facts. And then my initial reading of the appendices, Appendix A, I thought, here's some additional context for people who aren't rocket scientists who used to work for Lockheed Martin, I guess, who can, to help us think it through. But then
Appendix A is where we get here's the chemicals involved, and here's the molecular structure of a collapsium node and stuff like that.
But even there, it's not all that you get, because there are whole conversations that McCarthy perhaps thinks are going to disrupt the flow of the novel. One conversation between Marlin and Bruno is entirely included in an appendix, in Appendix A. The glossary also is really interesting to me because they're vocabulary words, but even in the glossary, we learn which things historically were attributed to which person. Notably, the arc defend winds up being attributed to Bruno in the glossary. That's a huge point of contention in the novel, where Marlin wants to have the credit for having made the arc defend, discovered the arc defend.
Even the arc defend is like a sort of time telescope that will let you see the end of time. And that's what both of them are working towards, and that's what the contention is.
Yeah, so that attribution in the glossary is actually a pretty important revelation that's in the glossary. And then Marlin, the antagonist's backstory, doesn't actually make its way into the novel proper, but it is Appendix D, where we find out about sort of his backstory. So I would like for y'all to indulge me for a moment. I would like to play 2 games.
No.
And then,
God.
And then it's going to be an interactive game. So
we're almost an hour into the recording. We're starting a game.
We're starting
Excellent.
a game. Well, these games come from composition studies, which is, some of my background as an academic. We're going to play 2 games. They're called the doubting game and the believing game. Peter Elbow, who is a composition theorist, and for anybody to whom his name means something, I just want you to know this is only for those people to whom this means something, and you know who I'm talking about when I say Peter Elbow. He has sat in my car. He got Cheez-Its on his butt from my kid had left those Cheez-Its there, and he was super cool about it. So Peter Elbow, real swell guy. Anyway, he proposes he proposes that when we read a text, and he's particularly gearing this toward people who are maybe thinking about how to become critical readers, right? He proposes that we play 2 games when we read a text. We play the doubting game and we play the believing game. So when we play the doubting game, we ask questions about it. We say, hey, what's up with this? What's this bullshit? Why have you done this? This seems like a problem. And when we play the believing game, we give them credence, and we take them in good faith, and we think it through and we believe with them. So I'm going to play both the doubting and the believing game with this whole appendix situation. For the doubting game, I wonder, are these appendices crucial to the book, or are they extras? It's arguable to me about the science. I think in some ways it is sort of extra. it's fraught when it comes to the narrative components. I would say the conversation between Bruno and Marlin that I mentioned in Appendix A and Appendix D, Marlin in particular, those are two fraught narrative components that are included in the appendices. Also, and y'all can tell me what you think about this, if you review Appendix C, I feel super confused from a point of view perspective. Appendix C reads to me as McCarthy in the year 2000 in our timeline, whereas the other three appendices A, B, and D are from that future historian perspective.
Yes, I concur.
Yes. Richard Powers is like, I have books. Yeah.
I think C is out of character, if you will.
Yeah, that's weird, right? Like Appendix C being out of character, but then I've got D on the end explaining the antagonist to me. What the fuck? What are you doing? I don't get, like... And I should confess that I do have a bit of a pet peeve about point of view changes. Like, I know we could have a go at Twilight on a lot of different notes, but that point of view bullshit in that fourth book is unforgivable. This is far less. We're talking about Appendix C, but still, you've written a whole book from this perspective, including Appendix D, notably.
Oh, from the perspective of this future historian?
Why is Appendix C in your voice? Yeah, like that to me is not, it does not work for me.
Okay, on the point of view stuff, as I was reading, and we're fully in what Bruno is doing very deep in the story, there's a point at page 281, so about halfway through the book, and then there's a point, I think the one that really struck me was very late, when the author suddenly switches back to that, hey, you, reader, watch this thing. Mm-hmm. Like the opening pages. So let me read just the very opening for the listener. I'll start with the third paragraph. Walk with him. See his footpath cutting through the blossomy meadow. Feel the itch of pollens in your eyes and nose. Now pass through the midday forest, etc., etc. The opening is like this for several pages, and then it falls away. And then later, there's a couple more bursts of that perspective, which really startled me. I was like, oh, right, shit, right. Who is this narrator? Does that point of view change irk you, Lucy?
No, I think it's consistent.
Okay.
I think it's fairly consistent. Like, I have half of my notes are, who are we? Because it has it in a bunch of times, just like we or reader or whatever. I have no issue with it because I think it's consistent. Yeah. The only inconsistency is Appendix C, and it does irk me. Mainly because it's Appendix C, and then there's a D.
We can play the believing game, but I've got an idea.
Well, yeah, let's play the believing game. And I will say this, it is genuinely clever to include the historical perspective as a component of the glossary. I think that unabatedly. I think the glossary is very clever, and I think those ideas about history that are included there is very clever. I also think there's an argument to be made that by reading, including this way of reading the appendices, especially with the footnotes early on, McCarthy is arguing that all of the information in the appendices is actually pretty important, right? Like, he's sort of saying, well, these are appended, but they're not extra, right? They are important, crucial components of the narrative, and this is a narrative structure that I have chosen for this text because I'm saying something about structure and what we call appendices and what all that means, and it's part in some ways of the meaning of this text. So that's my believing game. So I guess I'm kind of written an Am I the Asshole post on behalf of Wil McCarthy, and I'll invite you guys to judge. Like, what do you think? Is this a clever narrative strategy, or is it sort of a trick that doesn't really hold up? AITA.
So.
Well, no, AWMTA.
Is Wil McCarthy an asshole?
Okay, just ignore this. Carry on.
So there's I'm going to put in a footnote here that will maybe help explain this. There's an image that's introduced maybe in book 3. It's introduced weirdly late in the book of the way that turbulence in various physical processes works. Where, like, if you look at smoke rising from a candle, it'll rise in a single thread, and then it'll bifurcate into two, and then it'll split again and, like, make little swirls and so on. And then it'll be very, like, kind of pretty and geometric, and then at some point it just turns into chaos. It turns into an unstructured thing of smoke again. So it starts off unstructured and singular, then it splits and splits and splits, and then it becomes this cloud again. And this is a book where people are constantly, like, returning to the same situation. Like, book one, the sun's broken. Book two, the sun's broken. Book three, the sun's really broken. People are copying themselves, splitting themselves in two, and then reintegrating themselves together, making their memories match up. There's a whole lot of gravity imagery, people being pulled towards each other, people being pushed away. And the structure of this book, I think, is also exploring that idea of, like, how if you split something up too much, it just becomes chaos. And it isn't relevant to the summary, so it kind of got glossed over. But the reason why Bruno is trying to make True Vacuum because he thinks it'll help him see the end of time. But the way that he makes True Vacuum is he makes a box, and he removes all the air, all the stuff from that box, and ends up with a vacuum. And then he makes a box around that and uses the same technique to remove even more stuff out of it. And then he makes a box around that, or maybe it's inside. But he's recursively making a vacuum in order to somehow try and get a true vacuum, and he never quite makes it because, obviously, it's a Zeno's paradox thing, right? You're never going to get a perfect vacuum. You're never going to get to distill information down to its details. And so I think that like, part of the appendices are the idea of, like, things have been eliminated from this history. Things have been eliminated from this book. And some of the things that have been eliminated are super important. Like, one of the most intimate discussions between Bruno and Marlin happens in an appendix heading Muon contamination. Muons are short-lived, Bruno noted, perhaps too gruffly. Time dilation has extended their lifespans, and they have this whole discussion. Bruno says, "You see through the murk of my thoughts," to Marlin. Like, Bruno thinks Marlin's super cool. Bruno's like, Marlin's a genius. Marlin is like, this jackass is constantly showing me up. And, like, this is maybe the final conversation we see those two men have before book 3 starts and the solar system is breaking apart. And that's something that this future historian decided just belongs in an appendix, in a format screw in appendix, because, like, the first section of the appendix A is like, let's talk about exactly how these things work. There's no narrative, no characters are doing anything, there's no dialogue. And then by the final section, defeating inertia, that's entirely, it talks about Bruno smoking some weed and getting a tray of bagels. Like, it is completely dispensed with that idea of, like, scientific detachment.
God damn, I could go for some weed and bagels.
It sounds good.
It sounds great.
But I think that what this book is doing is sort of looking at how details get lost if you look from too great a distance, and like, there's this intimacy that's often inaccessible, and it's sort of reaching towards that vagueness. And the fact that Appendix D is Marlin's backstory, and, like, why is Marlin so upset? What was it like for Marlin trying to date the Queen and because Marlin was the first philanderer, or philander. Marlin is the first philander, and then Bruno kind of sweeps in and replaces him. But Marlin was also the Queen's, like, tutor. Like, when I think they were both adults at that point. No, I'm sorry. She was 8.
She was 8 years old.
Yeah. Marlin met her when she was 8, and then left, and then much later, when they were both immortal, met again. and he was selected.
My Twilight reference was not entirely unprovoked by this book. There are lots of children who eventually marry people who knew them when they were children, which I guess is an inevitable side effect of people living forever.
Yeah, but it's also like there's this constant implication that Marlin's just weird, like in a bad way. Like there's all sorts of things about Marlin that are just off. He's just not. He just. I mean, he
his
reacts
house
to things the creepiest way. I'm going to talk about his house in later, in 10 forward.
So I'm thinking about the appendices. There's something that, and I don't know if this is the kind of reader that I can accidentally be sometimes, but if I'm reading a book and it has footnote references that have me flip back to the back of a book, and I read some of them, and they are not interesting. They are just, citations with no additional commentary. I'm gonna stop looking at them unless I really think I'm gonna note that reference. So someone reading this sees those first 2 appendices and is like, I don't need my sci-fi this hard, and then stops checking the appendices. I feel like that's a trick. I feel like this is a thing that is being done by the author, fairly or otherwise. But I see myself in this.
And that's why Appendix C is non-fictional from McCarthy's perspective, and D is about Marlin, because these things are hidden, have shoved away. Like intimacy and interiority are things that are most quickly discarded in this sort of historical long view. And so, like, in a way, the whole plot is driven by the fact that Marlin had this experience that no one else knew about. No one else knew how grumpy, how, like, toxically resentful Marlin was. And it was just tucked away in the back of the book because no one paid attention to it. And it's, in fact, like, that story is, in terms of, like, all of the billions of people that died over the course of the story, that backstory is, like, one of the most important events that's described in the book. And it's just, like, off in Appendix D, because the historian has no way of accessing this, right? The historian can't read Marlin's mind.
So that's why you're saying it's outside of the point of view of that historian.
Yeah. I think that with each appendix, we're stepping further and further away from this like popular narrative historian. Like Appendix A is like, these are unimportant things. B is like, I'll put a glossary. And C is entirely out of character. And then D is this omniscient narrator. Unlike the omniscient historian, it's this eye of God reading the mind of Marlin.
Here's why I am unconvinced. And that is because we are directly told in the text the time when we don't know what was happening with Bruno, because he made it so that history could not access what was happening with Bruno. It is not my understanding that what is told in Appendix D is inaccessible to history. I don't have that sense that this is not something that historians don't have any access to.
I think there's the implication that this is assembled in part from Bruno's writings afterwards, and Marlin doesn't. Marlin pulls who's the Shakespearean villain? Is it Iago? Who's like, I'm not going to say another thing.
It is
like
Iago?
That's what Marlin pulls. He and Bruno have a one final night before Marlin's exiled for all of this.
Well, I sometimes, one of my metrics for art, for like evaluating art, is how much I think about it after the fact. So we'll see if this appendix thing continues to plague me, because that might be that it is, maybe it's done something good. With the main topics covered, it's time for a quick lightning round of other interesting things we spotted.
Okay, so I talked about sci-fi. This is also kind of this is almost a fantasy book. So it's clearly doing alchemy stuff. Like there's this genius locked away in this mystical, this strange place, this planet, way too small, impossibly small if not for his knowledge. And he's refining things. He's taking the fundamental building blocks of existence and linking them together. He's clearing away the matter out of something. This is alchemy. Like, the idea of dissolution and amalgamation, of like breaking stuff apart and putting it back together again, of purifying things and then recorrupting them. Like, he's an alchemist doing magic out on the edges of the solar system. This whole book is a big wizard battle. It's two geniuses using their inexplicable powers to launch satellites at each other, to fire beams that no one else can detect, that all this inexplicable stuff. And it ends in a dungeon crawl. Like, Lissa joked earlier, but it really is like they go to Mercury, they latch on, because they don't have a door, they have to melt through the ground in order to kind of create an airlock for themselves, and then like go into a room where Bruno has a magic staff. He has a staff that he can poke at things to make them die, and is it a sword that someone else? What does Chang have? Does Chang have a sword?
He has a sword and maybe a gun.
Maybe
also
loses
the gun.
And they're like fighting their way through waves of robots, and then they like bust through the wall into the next room, which maybe has different robots. I forget what the next room. Maybe it's traps, then robots, and then they break in, and there's a big spider monster that they have to fight with their magic staff and sword, and then they finally
and their familiar
go into
has to come help.
Yes, yeah. Hugo comes. Good old Hugo, the robot who's trying very hard.
The Sam Gamgee of
Yeah. And then, like, they finally confront the wizard and out-wizard him. And, like, I don't know what this book is doing. Like, this is my appendicitis for this. Like, why is this book that clearly is playing with hard sci-fi, why does it very clearly directly be like, these are two wizards, and this is one wizard invading the dungeon of the other wizard? Like, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know what this book is doing in that part. And like the ghosts earlier mentioned, like there's the scientific explanation for how like future archaeologists can reconstruct a scene based on all of this stuff, but like it really is a ghost. Like it really is just like future archaeologists summon up the person's ghost using object reading on the stuff nearby in order to figure out what happened.
I will say, to his credit, his McCarthy's credit, I did appreciate that wizard battle did not. It was quick. Marlin was quickly deposed once they got there, and I was very grateful. So
it's basically just punch him in the face and hold him down. Like that's about all that happens.
He went down. Great.
Book 3 was good, but it felt long.
Mm-hmm.
It felt fuller of explanations. Which, again, good explanations, but I was kind of like, wow, this, like, almost half of the book, in terms of page count, was book 3, I think.
It's another example of the bifurcation, where there's a first book that's size 1, second book, the same size, third book of the novel is the size of 2 of them put together, that's splitting and coming back together.
Yeah. Speaking to the alchemy part of this, something that kept striking me is that, you know, we know that that Bruno has robots, will use them, will automate things. However, there's quite a bit of time with his hands spent in special gloves, which remind me of, like, I don't know what they're called, Lucy. I think you've thought of them more recently than me, but the glove box that you operate in a closed environment.
Still air box.
Yeah, him manually manipulating these objects is
specifically I think he's using Waldo's. He's using robotic hands that are controlled by his movements.
By his movements, right? It's a very hands-on process of this breaking apart and reassembling and trying not to mess it up. And given how precise you would think this stuff has to be, we're dealing with, like, if anything falls into one of these tiny black holes, it will get bigger and start to consume everything around it because it becomes bigger than the size of one proton, right? Like, this is the kind of scale we're working with, and he's doing this shit by hand, effectively. I think that feeds into that alchemy idea of it being old-fashioned and rustic.
You know, I did find it really, it was surprising when we saw the monstrous version of the playwright at the end of book 2. But even after that, it was surprising when we met the monstrous version of the playwright in the mini boss in the dungeon crawl. And it did, now that you mention it, like that idea of having these sort of literal monsters did kind of feel like a weird element, you know, in this book, especially since, and I think one of you noted this earlier, you didn't see a lot of people who are like changing their bodies in ways that maybe they would want to. Like,
right.
Maybe I'd just like to have an extra pair of arms, you know? So it does kind of point to sort of a monstrousness that is being played with maybe here.
Speaking of non-human things, Lissa, you've got a fun topic here.
Speaking of familiars. Okay. My baby Hugo. Let's talk about Hugo. So,
Hugo did nothing wrong.
Hugo did nothing wrong. Hugo's the best. I was very concerned. The angle of my concern changed over the course of this novel. So we meet at the beginning of the second book. We meet Hugo, who is a robot who has been detached from the house and detached from the network of this little planet, of Bruno's planet. And Bruno did it very idly, very casually, as an experiment. Just sort of detached, wanted to see what happens if a robot isn't given direction. Because robots are sort of, they have a sense of purpose, which is to please humans, to please their humans or whatever. Generally non-sexually. There's a whole thing about that in the first book.
Some people fuck robots. I think there's a line that's some people fuck robots. It's a little weird.
It's considered couth, or uncouth. There's a whole couth and uncouth thing. But Hugo, when freed, and I like just put quotes around that every time, can't even walk. Hugo is a pile on the ground, and gets tripped over.
And it's talked about mewling, like making weird like cries.
Like a cat.
Oh, the mewling was too much.
Well, this is literally, he's literally playing God here, right? Like, it's Bruno deciding to create life, kind of arbitrarily and capriciously.
And it also, as this progresses, we get these, these little snippets. Hugo also takes his limbs off, removes his own arms and legs. So there's, I don't know, it's unclear if that's just exploration or if that's mutilation, but the thing is, Bruno doesn't give a shit. Like, Bruno doesn't really care, which I think is incredibly problematic. So in this, when the queen comes in the beginning of book 2, she's like, Bruno, what the fuck did you do, man?
Oh yeah, she definitely came in book 2.
Yeah. Did she? Unconfirmed.
The book is, I think, very clear that Bruno's an excellent lover.
Yeah, I think it's very clear.
Oh, you think so?
I think the queen explicitly is like, it never was the sex that was the problem. It was this other thing.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. So the queen says, robots have no volition, Declarant. No desire to do anything but fulfill, nor do they possess intelligence unless you'd count raw intuition as such. You severed the link to its processor, its ability to grasp and assess the very needs it must fulfill? He nodded again. Just so. She says, how unkind. You leave it helpless and confused in an environment beyond its comprehension. Bruno shrugged. Such is the nature of freedom, Highness. I've often said that life is nothing more than the choices thrust upon us when ability and incident collide. Which of us truly knows our course? Generally, we don't even know the landscape beneath our course. It's a terrible gift in some ways, but a great one as well. Hugo is more fortunate than some. Hugo, at this point, is just laying on the ground. He returns later, and Hugo is walking. He returns later, and Hugo asks for a hug. There's just this progression, right? And aside from this just tugging at my heartstrings, sci-fi, as we have read in The Wild Robot, etc., is very concerned with the ownership and the contents of a robot's brain. what is in there by default? What is the intuition that a robot has or doesn't have? What is the constructed knowledge on top of that? And what does it mean for a robot to be free? And or wild?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question about what it means for Hugo to be free, to me was answered very problematically in book 3 when Hugo shows up to save Bruno, and ends up fighting off all the bad robots, but being basically mutilated by them in that process. And it just, it felt like, what has Bruno done to help Hugo aside from this severing, this offering of what he calls freedom, which maybe, I'm not, I do think there's a possibly interesting exploration there, but Bruno has generally seemed very apathetic toward Hugo's struggles, but then is like, showed up in the end, old sport, or something like that. And I don't know. I mean, it actually reminded me of very strongly, I don't know, y'all can tell me, I'll just say this and then y'all can tell me if we should cut it out. What it reminded me of strongly was a scene in the Harry Potter series where Dobby, who's a house elf who Harry Potter frees from slavery in an early book, is in one of the last books, basically sacrifices himself and gets killed to save Harry. Right?
Fun.
That is a very problematic... I feel like that's very problematic to go around freeing people and then they sacrifice themselves immediately for the people who freed them. I don't know. I don't know that that's as... I don't know that kind of narrative says something great about freedom particularly,
I think this book is much more aware of the problem than the Harry Potter books are. The Harry Potter books are everyone was right. House elves are meant to be slaves. That's textual in the books. That Dobby's weird because he wants freedom. But in this book, it's Bruno says he's freeing the robot. He clearly isn't, right? He's doing an experiment with it that he's justifying to himself as freeing. And on a certain narrative level, Hugo and Bruno have the same arc in their lives. Bruno existed in one space where he got to be a genius, and then he kind of came to the court, and either the queen or God or some combination of that freed him from his material needs, made him rich, made him consort to the queen of all things, and he kind of was lost and self-destructive and not sure how to act at court, and kind of first hid his identity and then went into self-imposed exile and became this weird hairy prophet. And as that each of them comes to a point in their lives in their struggle where they choose to kind of give themselves up to the very system that freed them against their will. Bruno chooses to kind of sacrifice a whole lot, give up his home, give up a lot of things in order to save the human race, and Hugo allows himself to be harmed in order to let Bruno survive, and to save the human race ultimately. And there's a parallel there that I think this book is hey, probably Bruno shouldn't have been brought to court, and Hugo probably shouldn't have been freed, but once that happened, they became the new kind of person that they were, and that new person also deserves to exist and deserves to decide what they want to be.
Well, so the thing I want to mention a little bit, really, I've linked back to Gregory's fantasy setting. I've titled this "The Princess and the Feminist Catastrophe," because the way Tamra, who was a princess when she was a child and then becomes an unwilling queen, is portrayed in this book was often problematic to me. She's a princess. She's not interested in the science. She's beautiful and she's powerful, but she's not embroiled in the same kind of intellectual conversations that her suitors, Marlin and Bruno, are included in.
She's 100% a girl boss.
100% a girl boss.
Vibe.
And it's like, does her slot have to be filled? Because when she's dead, this handmaiden who has never been mentioned of any, like, is suddenly an important character who's mentioned all the time.
The handmaiden that is so important in book 3 is the one that puts Bruno and Marlin in the same outfit in book 1. That's the same character. So she's the BFF of the queen bitch who is trying to undermine the person she thinks is not good enough for her friend.
I would still argue that she's sort of in that role of princess when Tamra is not around to be the princess. Mm-hmm. And her, both of them are there to be saved and comforted. And I do think, especially when Melissa was reading their summary about Tamra and how she sacrifices herself unnecessarily, I mean, even that's sort of problematic, right? Like, she doesn't even get to save people. She can only be saved. She can only be that sort of passive role. And then, Bruno only kicking into gear in order to save her. Like, he could have had, if he wanted, a relationship with her. Like, he could have not been on internet-free planet. He could have been doing other things. But when it's a bad matter of saving her, that's really important. And then I don't know, the whole Marlin as villain, and he really is, in Appendix D, like another reason for part of my disdain for it. It's like, he really is motivated by resentment and jealousy. And that's unfortunate.
I do want to say, in the book's partial credit, good representation does not somehow balance out bad representation, but there are 2 other women in this story that are, I think, real cool. The best character in the book, Vivian, who's this, she was an expert detective, and then she didn't like having copies of her saved with the fax machine, so when she dies, they had mental records but not physical records, so they had to take her as a child and put her adult brain in, not in a creepy anime way, but it's just she's kind of struggling to be look, I'm physically 8. Is that 11? How young she is? 11?
I'm not actually. I'm actually sure we get an 8. He guesses her age.
Okay,
but it's
but she's old enough to be able, that you expect her to be able to speak full English, but just barely. And she's really cool. And Delia is also super cool. The mechanic basically of the crew. So I mean, Bruno assembles a party for his dungeon crawl. He it's Bruno, it's Muddy, who's the barbarian, I guess. He flies off into the outer reaches of the solar system to pick up Delia, and then he goes and Vivian is on the ship where the queen died. And those 2 characters, I think, super cool. Yeah. Delia could be is the classic sci-fi character who happens to be a woman but is written just completely gender neutral. I think Vivian is definitely written femme and also is very cool.
I agree with you. I really like Vivian. I think Vivian is a great character. Delia also manages to have to be saved by Bruno, I would note. Maybe Vivian too. Everybody gets saved by Bruno. So I guess it's not entirely about characters in some of my concerns about this book. It just kind of seems like the only access that we get to a lot of the important parts of the book, like this whole quandary over science and how the Collapsium works, and like the important things about the book, it all just seems sort of only accessible to these sort of brilliant geniuses.
There's even an early part where, like, in book 1, the queen has an idea on how to save the planet, and both dudes are like, oh ho ho, we both know that won't work, ha ha, she's trying it anyway. But yeah.
Yep.
So it just feels very I don't know, it would probably have felt different if Marlin was written film, for example, right? It just feels like, is this, can this sort of either genius or villainy, is this only the purview of masculinity? Like, and to have like so much of femininity seem to be tied to being an object in some ways. Just, I don't know. This book felt in those ways to me much older than it is. It felt much older to me than 2000 in those kind of gendered portrayals. And I think actually ties in with something that Gregory had said earlier too, like about how little exploration, like you don't see any pansexuality or bisexuality or queerness or gayness even, right? It's just very hetero and very masculine, and it does feel to me very much older than 2000. I don't know.
It's looking at toxic masculinity 100%, right? Like, it's examining masculinity, being like, what things are good, what things are bad, but not with any perspective other than that masculinity.
Yeah, and I think it's trying to put a bow on it by everyone finding out at the end that this is the historical narrative of the king of the solar system, right? Like, we don't know what the bow on this package is until the very end when he's crowned, and you're like, oh, all right, here's the tail. And so I think that's the that's the hat put on it. Of like, well, of course it's, this perspective, because turns out this is actually the only person we're interested in, and everything else revolves around him, which, now that I say revolves around him, there is a scene in the first book when Marlin and Tamra and Bruno are together, and Bruno describes it as the two of them revolving around Tamra, as if she were a center, and this whole story is that for Bruno, I guess.
There's a lot of gravity and orbit imagery throughout.
Yeah, I love when books explore various things symbolically as gravity, culture and gravity, or a particular person having gravity in a way that's interesting. But that's neither here nor there.
I think Copenhagen, I think, does it in an interesting way. If you ever want to see, I think, a book that kind of parallels characters with maybe how molecules behave, like a nucleus and electrons and that kind of thing, I think Copenhagen is which is about Heisenberg, and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, is really successful with it. Oh, I do. One thing that I've thought about a lot since I read it was that, and I believe we alluded to it once, that, Marlin's been saving extra faxed copies of lots of people and torturing them, but he can't successfully do that with Tamra. He doesn't like keeping her and torturing her. And I think that's interesting. I do think there's something interesting there. Like,
yeah.
I mean, does it point to a sort of romanticism, like that he genuinely loves her and doesn't like that experience, or Is it something else? I'm not sure. But I did think it was pretty evocative.
He keeps and tortures himself.
He does.
And is perfectly willing to do that, but not her.
Yeah.
Muddy says he is the worst to the copies of himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole section on sociopathy, perceptions and concepts of sociopathy in this book too, because it's wrestling with that. The romance in this book is bizarre to me, quite frankly. As someone who,
so with you.
Like, I'm a person who reads romance books. I have particular tastes and subgenres of interest, but I read romance books. And whenever I read romance stuff in traditional sci-fi, not like an urban fantasy equivalent, but like sci-fi ass sci-fi, I am always like, is this written like a romance book? Is this pulling literary romance? Or is it endeavoring to emulate real world romance? And this shit is, I don't know what the fuck this is.
This is pulp sci-fi romance.
Yeah, this is neither of those.
This is the genius space hero gets to bed the princess sort of stuff. This is Buck Rogers.
Him finding out at the end that it was all about love all along is really just
so cringe.
Yeah, not my favorite type of romance.
Not the best. In addition to the deep stuff, we're also big utopian sci-fi fans, so let's head to 10 Forward to talk about stuff we geeked out about. I'll start with faxing, because I think it's one of the most genuinely fascinating things about this book, is the concept of faxing. And it is interesting to me that it only goes so far and no further, honestly. I mean, I would think there would be so much you could do with this concept that is unexplored. And maybe it becomes more explored in the sequels because there's so much going on with it. But I think, as we were just talking about, Marlin's brand of torture and control having to do with those faxed copies, that's interesting. You know, that's interesting villainy that he's doing there. I think early on, Bruno talks about how he doesn't like to make fax copies of himself because they'll just end up with some other project that they become all focused on.
Yeah, he can't have someone help him because they'll get distracted because they'll want to work on their own stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're only introduced to that idea in the second book. First book doesn't introduce the idea of copies this way. It's only when we meet Delia and Marlin in the second story that we get this idea of, the ghost, obviously, but like copies and copies and copies.
Yeah, I have a note somewhere around the beginning of book 2 that's like, so is this society just fixed cloning? Do they just understand all the implications now? And the answer is nope.
Nope.
Turns out they don't.
Definitely not. And that scene with the double murder when Delia and Marlin get murdered a whole bunch, I was thinking then, like, how does one keep track of all the copies of oneself? I mean, the answer the book has is you do not. You do not have access to your copies. So if you're making a whole bunch of copies, I mean, good luck. They might go off and do some other shit and you wouldn't even know about it. And apparently people can make copies and you not even know about it.
Do y'all know about the whole sort of medical situation with faxing and sort of HIPAA and this whole thing? So before,
no, like in our world of our
in our
faxing?
actual, yeah. So for like purposes of like HIPAA, there were certain ways you could only, I mean, I guess there are
this
still.
This is the U.S. health privacy law.
Exactly. Only certain ways you could transmit records. And before everything was electronic, one of those, very commonly used, was faxing. And if you have ever worked in a doctor's office or a hospital charting room or anything like that, and you look at that fax machine and you see the quantity of refuse left of things received and never picked up, things sent and the originals not taken, just the sheer mess of a fax machine, and you could abscond, like it's the whole thing. It's a whole thing, where people were like, digital records can't be safer, and you're like, safer than what? this. And so I thought about that as, when it took me a while to realize that the interstitial between book 1 and book 2, where we see this, we understand that ghosts are real, and it says Bruno was simultaneously diverted. It took me probably 50 more pages. I kept coming back and going, simultaneously diverted, like, what does that mean? And then before I finally tied together kind of what was happening there. But I worked in a doctor's charting room at a major hospital here in Charlotte for years, and that image of that fax machine and the copier fax machine is burned in my head of just what a fucking mess it was, and the degree of security required to get access to that fax machine. So the fact that faxing, I kept wondering, were there going to be more layers pulled? Like, finding out that they were destroying people and transferring information was kind of one reveal that wasn't immediately given. There's this sort of mess that keeps unfurling.
For folks that haven't read the book, the way that, like, faxing in the book looks and feels is that, like, there are these black walls that you walk into, and as you walk into it, you're disassembled, and then you feel yourself just walking out on the other side. But in the meantime, a signal has been sent at light speed, so it's kind of slow on solar system terms, from one to the other, and when you leave, most people save a backup copy every time they walk through, so that can be restored if something happens to you on the other side. But to you, as a continuous mind, you feel as if you've just stepped through a Stargate to the other side. Except without the cutscene that happens.
I do think it's an incredibly well-chosen name to call it faxing, because I think it evokes all the right things and the technology of it, and it's not so old that it's like you don't have to look up I don't know, like how operator boards or something used to work. Like, I think is really apt, really appropriate. Anyway, that's super cool.
And it's so mundane to the characters. Right. They're like, yeah, just fax yourself. Oh, you're feeling sick? You want to hop into the fax machine? And they're saying, oh, you're drunk? Do you want to have your body destroyed and recreated in order to stop you from being drunk? Like, It's weird.
Oh, another thing that maybe folks might not know if they weren't around in 2000 and have like full experience with fax machines is that you lose quality when you fax things, because the data transmission rate is very low. So if you have, it's like scanning a picture at a low resolution, you just lose stuff. And so you've seen copies of copies of copies of copies. When they started talking about that there's an institute that keeps the backups, and they and which is what keeps failing when people are, when Vivian couldn't be restored, they're still looking for her backup. And ultimately all their hard drives crashed. But anyway, that also sort of fits into the fax concept. And one thing, just to tie this whole fax thing into the broader technology, I mentioned in the summary that the ring collapsitor, this solar ring that's being made, I think I might have framed it as information or communication being faster, but that information is faxing people. That is one of the primary things that they want that data bandwidth for. So that's why it's a huge deal to these folks, even if, like, I think we might think, oh, you're going to make money on it, but it's just data going faster.
For another kind of duplication, the thing that I geeked about was rivals. I like the character dynamic of rivals in genre fiction. And like I said, as soon as Bruno and Marlon showed up, I shipped them. I was like, oh, I want these two to stop fighting over this queen and stop worrying about which one's better than the other and just like hang out and be bros or fuck or, both, whichever, however works best for them. That's what I wanted. And like, that obviously didn't happen because Marlin's terrible and Bruno's not terrible,
Also terrible.
but not great. Far, far better than Marlin. But
Sure.
the dynamic of rivals, the sort of formula of rivals, is they must be both similar and very contrasting, right? You want two people who kind of are in a similar circumstance, who are competing with each other, and they have this shared experience of the thing they're competing over, and then very different backgrounds and different approaches to it, and it's the ways in which those things are similar and different that makes their relationship interesting. And this is the anime protagonist and his grumpy rival. This is like your Horatio Hornblower, like two captains of two ships at a meeting at sword point, this sort of thing. And this book, I think, does a really good job at setting up that rivalry, because the Bruno is sort of the intuitive, comes up with ideas and doesn't know how to check them person, or doesn't want to check them person. Marlin is the person who has worked out all the details. Repeatedly in this book, Bruno will suggest an idea or like throw out an estimate off the top of his head, and Marlin will confirm that a week ago he did the math and that estimate is pretty much correct, but Marlin's able to give more detail on it. And their similarity is maybe most dramatically shown. I have a picture that I drew in at the start of chapter 9. I drew a picture because Bruno's home is, I'm showing it, and it's a stick figure representation of this. Bruno's home is a tiny little prince planet that he can like walk around in the course of 10 minutes. So he's a person whose house is on the outside of a little sphere. Marlin's house is this weird Greco-Roman Escher-esque structure that's a sphere that Marlin lives on the inside of.
Yep.
And so Bruno lives on a sphere looking out into space and looking out at the world, and Marlin lives inside a sphere always looking inward, looking at himself. And that distinction, that duality where it's like they both live, they're both of their homes are tiny spheres made just for them. But Bruno's home is one where he's looking out and like looking out of the void of space and wondering what his place is in it and wanting something. And then Marlin is living inside a cave that he is only concerned with his own stuff and looking at reflections of himself and his own failures and insecurities.
And they both sacrifice those homes in order, to pursue their ends that they think are important.
Yeah, Marlin fires his weapon at it to, I guess, remove suspicion and also wipe out as many copies of Delia and the others as he can. In fact, I think that's supposed to kill the Queen and Bruno. I think, because they only leave Marlin's home kind of coincidentally. That like Bruno has a sudden flash of insight and is like, we gotta go check on a thing, and that's how they avoid getting killed.
I think they leave because they get the call about the murders. And the murders don't all happen simultaneously.
The murders are supposed to happen simultaneously, but don't. Yep. Yeah.
Right. So the first double murder happens, and I was having trouble tracing which Delia died because Delia was also at the house. Yeah, the whole thing. But yeah, there's that first set, and then while they're there, another Chang runs up, I think, and is like, hey... more murders.
Yeah, I love that Chang Xiao is his full name.
Chang Xiao. Yeah.
I love that Chang is totally cool with copying himself. Like most other people are like, it's a little weird to have copies. Delia's like, yeah, I've got a copy of myself on every station, but they don't pretend to work together. Chang will just like be like, hey Chang, and just like be work with himself in a way that none of the other characters seem to want to.
Yeah.
But yeah, Marlon and Bruno are these weird counterparts, and one of the cool things about rivals in this sort of fiction is that often your rival is the only person who really understands you. Like, there are these two geniuses who are so different, and yet, like, no one else in the human race can understand what it's like to be this groundbreaking scientist who's fabulously wealthy and has dated the queen. Like, only Marlon and Bruno can really understand each other in that way. And so you mentioned earlier, there's this really touching scene at the end, weird and touching, like strange and creepy and weird, but also emotionally effective, where like execution isn't a thing that they want to do for some reason, but they have to find out some way to get rid of Marlon. They send him on a spaceship traveling relativistically off into the cosmos so that he will get to see the end of time, because his life will be stretched across all of history, and but in a way where he will never be able to reunite with humanity. And before that, Marlon and Bruno have like, they smoke weed and get drunk together and like talk about science all night, and then in the morning, Marlon is sent off to permanent exile. Did you have thoughts about that scene, Lucy?
I mean, I guess one of my big issues I have is that I don't like Marlon at all. I don't think he is relatable. I don't think he is a good guy. I think Appendix D makes it even worse. So to read about Bruno, like, yeah, let me have a party with this swell guy, I feel like, what? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just, like, I understand. I don't know. It kind of makes Bruno worse for me, too. Like,
yeah, I mean, Bruno's weirdly lonely. He's a weirdly lonely character. And the fact that he really wants one night with Marlon, even though Muddy survives, right?
Muddy does not survive. Muddy
goes into
sacrifices himself. That's the reason why he has to go and get the last couple of pieces of it that were starting to already fall into the sun.
That's right. He goes off and sacrifices
and he's
himself.
like, I'm also, he said, I was meant to show you what a terrible coward you are, but now I'm going to show you that you can be brave. It's, you know.
Yeah. So Bruno has no one who understands him after Marlon leaves. And like, to Bruno, apparently that's enough to make him be convivial with Marlon for just a little bit of time. And you get that other duality between Bruno and Muddy, where they're the same person initially, but one is a copy of the other. And, or, I mean, they're both copies, right? There is no real Bruno. Bruno was killed. That if you think that there's such a thing as a clone and a real copy, then that one died long ago, the very first time Bruno was faxed. And they're all just clones. And Muddy is like Bruno brought to his lowest, but also somehow is Bruno, like Hugo was freed of his like purpose and his guidance and his connection to society. Muddy was freed of all the things that are weighing Bruno down, where like Muddy doesn't care about looking abject because Muddy thinks he is trash. Bruno cares about being perceived as trash and worries that he is trash. Muddy is like, no, I am trash. I'm lower than dirt. Call me Muddy. And so like there's that duality there too, where Muddy's actions reflect on Bruno, but Bruno is not as brave as Muddy is, and maybe never will be, because he cares too much about himself.
So this is going to go back to Marlon again, so sorry for looping back to Marlon, but I just recently reread Peter and Wendy about Peter Pan, and there's a scene in the book where Captain Hook, who is the villain of Peter and Wendy, creeps into Peter's room to poison him. But in the paragraph before he puts the poison in Peter's cup or whatever, Peter's just sleeping. It talks about how Hook he likes flowers. He thinks they're pretty, and he enjoys music. He's great at playing the harpsichord. And it's kind of like he's a real person, but also he's going to do this really heinous thing. And you're going to, he's so set off by this scene of seeing Peter Pan sleeping innocently. That really triggers something in Captain Hook, because he's envious of Peter's youth. He's envious that Peter has a mother figure in Wendy who cares for him. He wants Wendy, but it is a really powerful moment, because it also, you see that Hook is not just this one-dimensional villain, all that we see, through Peter and Wendy's and maybe Tinkerbell, who's a bit of a brat in the book, perspective, and we just don't, I can't think of what we get like that from Marlin. I want to know that he loved flowers. I want to know that he read one of Winder's plays and was deeply moved, by the denouement, something about him that could make him in any way not horrible would be welcome.
He's joyless and awful. And that's about it.
There's a when Muddy and Bruno are first talking about what Marlin is up to, in the mass paperback, it's page 260. It's kind of deep into chapter 15, I think. Bruno felt a bomb burst of rage. What in God's name is driving this man? Why can't he just accept things as they are? I could kill him. He pretends to be merely jealous, a little bit bruised and snooty, a little bit nasty when crossed, and it's fine. People like him for it, or at least in spite of it. His wit and charm serve him well enough, and his genius. Why can't he just be that person? What's so savagely difficult, so brutally unfair about that? And this, to me, in addition to highlighting some very questionable things about Bruno, it also highlights the lack of depth of Marlin. All he can list here is Marlin's a petty bitch. These are the character traits. A petty bitch who can't even be a good petty bitch.
I feel it's really his own doing, right? If he has no connections in this galaxy outside of this terrible person, that's partly on you, Bruno. You made that world for yourself.
And I think part of the arc of the book is him learning, because by the third book, the reason he restores his internet connection is because he's I should have some fucking friends. This is bad.
This book is Bruno constantly realizing that he's awful.
Yeah. So I think on the flip side, one could look at that last party, the final night, and kind of say this is Bruno accepting a human connection where he can have it, and then being able to let it go. Because he could have put a stay of execution. He could have kept him around and talked to him and put a radio link in there. He could have done any number of things.
Could have tortured a faxed copy of him for a while.
Right. So I think it could be a sign of growth that he is laughing and singing and doing joyful things, that the only real emoting we see from Bruno is anger in book 3. And then we see Muddy and how, Muddy's version of emoting. So, yeah. Okay. Mine is short. It's short because it's just a little thing. In each of the 3 books, there is a description of the light that comes off of the ring or some sort of complex collapsium structure. And it's called, I'm going to say, Cerenkov light, maybe Cherenkov light, depending on the origin of the name. And in each book, it is distinct. So in the first book, so it's the first time he goes to fix, and he goes up to the mountain in Venus and sort of susses out the problem with the ring twisting. It is, once it's fixed, it says that haunting Cerenkov glow was gone, super reflected back into the body of the ring collapsitor. So that's book 1. In book 2, okay, the bottom of page 145, it says, on Bruno's own slate, Marlin's tracings were echoed and quickly became solid, detailed, three-dimensional looking images. The sun blazed, and the ring collapsitor, its thickness exaggerated by several orders of magnitude, glittered around it like a 2/3 completed crown. Fully half the structure, though, showed not the soothing blue of Hawking Cerenkov radiation, but a kind of dingy brown glow. And then in the third book, it is described as glowing blue as the ghosts of drowned sailors. And we get more ghost imagery, more haunting kinds of labels as we move through these books and have these different experiences. But I just like this recurring sense of like how Bruno is feeling about this thing he's interacting with. Because we see, I think, maybe beginning of book 3, where he's starting to lose some of the joy of discovery. Maybe that's the end of book 2, where he's wondering, which he later wonders about Marlin, like, what are you doing this for, my guy? And so these little bits of description of whether the glowing is soothing or scary or something else.
And if folks don't know, Cherenkov light is a real thing that exists in our world.
Yes.
You can look up videos of nuclear reactors, and they will glow this weird, eerie blue that's the result of some atomic process.
It is lovely imagery, and it's nice that you can see it sort of reflected through the 3 books.
Well, at the end of each episode, we pick the next thing we're reading based on some connection from this episode. So, the Collapsium has humanity politically united in a society apparently without disease or death, with extensive use of teleportation for travel.
Oh, shit.
So next time, we'll be reading a story with a similar premise. This one's a little bit of an unconventional work. We're going to be reading SCP-6001, Avalon.
Oh. Fuck. I always want an excuse to read SCP.
So yeah, this is part of the SCP Collaborative Writing Project at the SCP Wiki. That's Secure, Contain, and Protect is one interpretation of that acronym. And since it assumes sort of a certain amount of familiarity with that world, there's a lot of cross-references. I'm going to prepare a short glossary, a real glossary, not a cute glossary like this in this book, just a normal one, to help anyone who hasn't read much of it, including y'all too. You don't have to read the story or the glossary to enjoy the episode, or you don't have to read the glossary to enjoy the story, but I think it'll help inform some of this. But I'll link to both the story, which is freely available and real short, and the glossary in the show notes, so you can get those. And it also has a very good cat in it.
I don't think anyone's going to enjoy the episode if Alyssa and I don't read.
Yes, that you was to the audience. Y'all too, I expect you to read the story and the glossary if you want it. But,
yes, Professor.
But yeah, you can check that out.
So next time we'll be discussing SCP-6001 Avalon on Before the Future Came. You can find links and show notes at beforethefuture.space. Please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you found the show. If you have any questions or comments, comment on our website or write us at onscreen@beforethefuture.space, which is real. At least it's a real email address.
Mm-hmm. I'm Gregory Avery Weir, and you can find me at ludusnovus.net or on cohost at cohost.org/GAW.
I'm Melissa Avery Weir, and I'm over at urson.net and on Mastodon at melissa@urson.life.
And I'm Lucy Arnold, and sometimes blog at intertextualities.com. Our music is Let's Pretend by Josh Woodward, used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. Thank you for listening.
I'm sure we'll all live happily ever after, surrounded by butterflies, children, and laughter. It's a fairy tale story, so let's just pretend. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. Happily ever after.
There's a lizard in my office.
Oh,
I was
cool.
about to say, is everything all right over there?
It's the color of the carpet. So I'm not... Fuck, I just lost fucking track of it.
You should just cross your legs on your chair.
It's fine. It's a lizard. It's fine. Anyway, okay. Ring of robots.